the University of New York Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy, co-sponsored by the Center for Immigrant, Refugee, and Global Health at the CUNY SPH. The title of this panel conversation is What Next? Perspectives on the Future of Afghanistan. And we will run it as a conversation with three very formidable panelists. And the way we will start is I will introduce briefly the panelists, and then Dean Ayman El-Mohandes will say a few words, and then we can get started. So first, Zura Bahman, who is the country director for Search for Common Ground in Afghanistan. She has worked in the peace building and security field for over 20 years. She was in fact a youth delegate at the first Bonn conference on Afghanistan in 2001. She's also served as a senior advisor in the Afghanistan Ministry of Foreign Affairs. On women, peace, and security was her area in which she provided advice. And she's also worked for UN Women, the Afghanistan office. As we said, Zura is the head of Search for Common Ground in Afghanistan, an organization for which I have the privilege to serve on their governing board. And I hope you'll get an idea of Search's work and mission as Zura talks this morning. Next is Fatia Saroor. She's an international peace building and development expert with well over 25 years of experience in the UN, but also beyond the UN. Fatia was Assistant Secretary General in Somalia. She played a key role in the UN's peace building efforts there and in other countries. She's also a co-funder of the Justice Impact Lab, and for the Africa Group on Justice and Accountability. And Fatia is a passionate advocate for women's rights, for social justice, and for the fight against impunity. Our third panelist is Jacob Kurtzer. He's the Director and Senior Fellow with the Humanitarian Agenda of the Center for International and Strategic Studies. This is an initiative of CSIS that looks at a range of complex challenges. Before joining CSIS, Jacob had a distinguished career with the International Committee of the Red Cross and Refugees International, serving both at country level and in the United States and Canada as an advocate for those organizations and their constituencies. Jacob also served as a legislative assistant in Congress, so he's seen foreign policy making from almost every angle. So those are our three panelists. And with that, I will turn it over to the Dean to make a few introductory remarks.
Kathleen, thank you. And I cannot thank you enough, and thank Elizabeth and thank Jim Sherry for your leadership for the center in our school. You are bringing today a topic that is of significance. And I'm so proud that we centered as a graduate school of public health and health policy. CUNY is centered around issues of equity and social justice. And there couldn't be a more timely moment for you to have chosen such a wonderful panel to bring to our level of consciousness, and need I say, conscience, issues that surround the crisis in Afghanistan. So on behalf of the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy, I welcome you all to this panel on the current situation and future options of Afghanistan. I know that we have panelists joining us from Istanbul and London, and participants today online from across the globe. And let me start with a special thanks to our panelists, Zora, Fatiha, and Jacob. They come from different backgrounds and perspectives, but together represent a broad and deep knowledge of Afghanistan and the current challenges in the Afghan situation. I thank you for stepping up, and I know how busy the three of you must be at this very present moment. So giving us your time and wisdom is truly appreciated. As a public graduate school of public health, CUNY School of Public Health is committed to connecting research and action on real-time issues, real people, real challenges. We are publicly funded, and therefore we owe our allegiance we owe our support, and we owe our commitment to the public. For example, CUNY School of Public Health faculty and students are conducting research on modeling of the spread of COVID-19, while at the same time providing hands-on support to contact and tracing and vaccine promotion within communities in New York. We see this again in our Healthy Harlem initiative, which combines research on mental health and service provision with outreach to the surrounding neighborhoods. There is nothing more poignant to me than a situation like the one we will discuss today, where immigrant and global health and our local communities interface and intersect in the most urgent way. So what we will learn from you today, we will hopefully gain insights that we can apply to our response. Through the Center for Immigrant, Refugee, and Global Health, we are pursuing the same research action connections on a global scale. And this panel on what next perspectives on the future of Afghanistan is a case in point. This panel seeks to go beyond the headlines with which we are bombarded every day. And need I say our hearts are broken, but it will examine how local non-governmental organizations are supporting communities, focusing on the Afghan people themselves as leaders and frontline negotiators. It will explore the options facing women under Taliban rule, including their access to health and social service. It will also analyze how US policy is changing in response to recent events, as well as the role of other external actors. We hope that the panel is a starting point for a deeper discussion and engagement of CUNY School of Public Health and this looming political, migrant, and humanitarian crisis. And I promise you, as the dean of this school, that this is only the beginning of our involvement intellectually. And as an institution for higher education, we also promise you that this topic will be a priority in how we communicate the global issues to our students. So thank you for honoring us, honoring our request to be with us today. And the mic is yours, Kathleen.
Thank you very much, Dean. And thank you for including this in your Grand Round series, which I think is another demonstration of the seriousness of the approach that CUNY SPH is taking to global issues. So I'd like now to explain how we will run the next hour or so. As I said at the beginning, this will be more of a discussion than a series of presentations. So I will start by having a back and forth of about 3 questions each to each one of the panelists. During this time, we invite you to please write any questions you have in the chat so you don't lose them as each speaker proceeds. And at the end of the first round of questions and answers to the speakers, we will open it up for these questions. And Lisa Hitch, who you can see now on the screen, will be helping me moderate the chat, grouping questions and ordering them so we can try to cover as many issues as possible. So without further ado, I think we will start. And we will start with you, Zura. The CEO of Search for Common Ground, the organization for which you work, suggested recently, and I quote, that the international media's portrayal of the Afghan people, either as cowering victims unable to escape or lucky to get out, or as predators waiting to unleash their terror, exacerbates a sense of hopelessness. There has, in fact, been a much greater emphasis on how the Taliban have changed over the last 20 years than on how the Afghan people have changed over the last 20 years. So as an Afghan leading a national NGO, we'd love to get your perspectives on where you think the Afghan people are at this critical point in time.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. I'm very excited to be here. I was reflecting on CUNY, and I realized that just after the fall of the Taliban, and as I started to become more active in my community in Afghanistan, I actually went through a training on gender that was developed by CUNY, and I looked it up to see.
I think we've lost.
Your question is, your question is, I'm glad you asked this question, because I do see a need for us to pause and to look at the Afghan people of the 2021 and their potential as we imagine an Afghanistan that's going to be sort of that's forthcoming. And I think this reflection would help us and just have a more realistic and more, dare I say, optimistic
Zura, you're freezing. Maybe you should turn off your video. It might be helpful. Yeah.
I hope you can see me and you can hear me.
We can see you, but you're going in and out. So it might be good. It might be easier. Yes, I think so. Okay.
Okay. So I was just trying to explain that last time the Taliban took over, we were at the end of towards the end of a civil war. We were in a lot worse situation than we are right now. At that time, we had no functioning government in the immediate in the period preceding the Taliban. We did education system had completely collapsed. However, this time the Taliban have taken over at a time where we have record number of educated people, functioning governance structures, primary healthcare structures, education structures, and also, most importantly, a generation of people that have actually tasted freedom, that have tasted human rights, albeit with a lot of trouble, with a lot of gaps. And you know, when you taste something, you don't really feel like giving it up. And I think this is going to be the key to defeating any structure or any group that wants to come into Afghanistan and take away these freedoms. And the other thing we have is the connectivity. Last time we weren't connected to anything. I remember the last thing I saw on TV as the Taliban took over and we had to bring our antennas down was the CNN proclaiming the victory of the Taliban, and then that's it. We were shut, and we had very little one-way communication of BBC radio that was giving us the news of our own country. But right now, Afghanistan has one of the highest rates of in the region and globally growing of internet connectivity, very, very young population, and very qualified and very well skilled in using these new technology and equipment. And also in the years that the Taliban were in Afghanistan in the late 90s and the war before that, we had a lot of people moving into Europe, moving into America. There was mass migration of Afghans, and those Afghans are now established, very well established in places where decisions are made, Washington, Brussels, and London, and everywhere. And these people could exert their influence. They are on par with the Armenian diaspora, with the Palestinian diaspora, and they can raise our voices. And I think this is what we need to look at. And we are not sort of passive as we were when we were taken over last time. So we can spring into action a little bit more quicker.
Thanks, Zura. If that's the case, I mean, you talked about the increased connectivity and the connections that the Afghan people have now. How can, for all the Afghans that are now in their communities trying to figure out the next step, how how can they be empowered and given the agency really to determine their own futures? What do you think of the techniques or things that organizations like yours can do to support them to be frontline negotiators with the Taliban?
Afghanistan is a country where, like many other countries, I suppose, where we're in constant negotiation. It's a very decentralized country, although the governance structures have more or less always been very central, or there's been an attempt to centralize the country. We are a very decentralized people. And Afghan people themselves are in constant state of negotiations. Last time the Afghan people were faced with the Taliban, they were pockets they were spaces where women's education continued, where work continued. I always like to talk to people that led these efforts. And I always give this example. I think I gave this example to you as well, Kathleen, last time we spoke, that I used to work in public health, and I used to always wonder that why is it that in one district we send in people to distribute contraceptives, and there's a really excellent outcome, but in another district we have really poor outcome, even though both districts share a lot of similarities. So I always wondered. And then the key is that who do you have on the ground to negotiate? Who do you have on the ground to talk? Who do you have that knows that have their finger on the pulse of that area? And therefore, I think that strengthening people at district level, strengthening women, insider negotiators, to take up these issues that they're most passionate about, who have an understanding of how informal power structures work. How can they utilize the local tribal elders, the women in the area, wives, and mothers and mother-in-laws, and how could they utilize the local mosque so that the pressure could be exerted, so that the very sort of at the lowest level of the structure, the Taliban could make decisions such as allowing young children to access vaccinations, to allow women to go to work, to allow women to go and access healthcare, to allow young girls to go and get an education. And these things have happened before. And we need to realize that. It is really great to talk to the Taliban at the very top level. And I sit in meetings between foreign affairs ministries of various different countries. And there I see the discussion around things like aid conditionality. We're not going to give these several tens of millions of dollars to the Taliban unless they allow girls to school. But these decisions are not made at that level, or they are partially made at that top, at the topmost level of politics in Afghanistan and Kabul. These decisions are actually made at the very local level, and we need to create that power base. And also, we cannot get the international community to always to negotiate on our behalf at the very political level. We need to utilize the power of the Afghan people and the very indigenous, natural negotiating and constant bartering practices that we have, and also make sure that these practices are led by Afghans. We don't need a lot of gatekeepers anymore. We have been leading these processes. We've been learning about ourselves and about changing and adapting new methodologies for at least last 20 years or even more. So let us lead those processes. And I'm really proud to be part of CIRGH for Common Ground, where we believe in local leadership and we are able to implement some of these ideas. And I hope a lot of other international and national NGOs take up this effort because it's cheaper, and also they can use this passion that we have for our own people as well, which I think is the thing that keeps us going.
One question that some of the participants might be wondering, Zura, is the room to maneuver that a group like CIRGH for Common Ground will have. I mean, how is that negotiated? I mean, is that also very community? I know you're a national NGO, but who will decide if CIRGH for Common Ground continues to be allowed to build the agency and negotiating skills of local communities?
Well, it's this question can be answered at two levels. Number one, the Taliban decide. I mean, they hold Afghanistan. They decide who works there and who doesn't. But then it is up to us to continuously introduce ourselves, to see if we are going to find a common ground between deeply divided communities. One of the deeply divided communities could be ourselves and the Taliban that may disagree with some of our ideas. So we constantly engage with them. We constantly engage the communities they come from, the rural, let's say, southern Afghanistan, and we help them understand the utility of our work. But then the second thing is it's also in the hands of our international donors. We have to wait and see what the international donors decide. Right now, we are in a position where the Taliban can see our point of view, the utility of a peace-building organization. However, our international partners may decide that they no longer want to give any money to Afghanistan, just in case some of the money goes through the taxes we pay into the Taliban pockets or the government pockets who are held by the Taliban. And the other thing is people themselves. Like right now, we work with we are actually an international NGO. So in Afghanistan, we act as an international NGO, but we work through local partners. And a lot of the times, our local partners act as intermediaries, not only between us and the Taliban, but between us and many other groups and between other international organizations and the Taliban and other groups. So they have sort of, they do they play this intermediary role. And then we can leave if we want to, but our local partners would always be there, and they're going to create that space where peace building could take place.
Okay, good. The last question for this round, Zura, is that when we spoke earlier, you expressed the desire to talk a little bit about the diaspora that you mentioned before. I remember you said that the Afghans who are leaving are still there, and where they land, they can continue to be advocates and promoters of the best possible future for Afghanistan. Could you talk just a couple of minutes about how that's organizing and how you see that happening?
Well, the first part is the existing diaspora, the established diaspora in Europe and North America. So there's a massive number of Afghan people that have left Afghanistan in the last 40 years, and a lot of them that have established themselves in the region, but more importantly in Europe and North America, have got, they lead businesses, they are part of professions, they are advocates, they are community mobilizers and so on. And they have provided support. They have been able to fundraise and meet the immediate needs in Afghanistan, humanitarian projects, small and medium and big. But they've also, more importantly, ensured that the focus remains on Afghanistan. So they've made sure that they do demonstrations. They've made sure that they go on TV, that they are constantly bombarding us with a reminder of Afghanistan on social media. They have really shaken things up, and that's really important. We couldn't have done it from inside Afghanistan while being in the middle of the disaster. So they need to continue to do that. The second one is obviously the people that have left. They've just left. There's over 200,000 people that have left, and they're the best. I mean, human life is obviously all valuable, but these are our most experienced and educated people, journalists, human rights activists, doctors, engineers, and civil servants and so on. They have left, but they are at a point in their career that they're very well connected to Afghanistan. And just because they're physically out, it does not mean that the Afghanistan has they've been disconnected from Afghanistan. They need to be immediately engaged with the existing diaspora, but also within international organizations, within the lobby groups, within those that want to decide to go back into Afghanistan or put money into Afghanistan. These people need to be utilized, and they need to also be utilized for their own good, because I haven't been a refugee myself. I can realize that they must be in a very fragile psychological situation, and they want to be utilized, and we need to keep them going and help them see the positive steps they can take.
Okay, thank you very much, Zura. Let's turn to you now, Fatia. Let's move from the Afghan, well, a little bit from the Afghan, a direct focus, the Afghan people, back to the Taliban. I think we can agree that the news we're getting bombarded with is relentlessly hopeless in terms of what are the options facing women. I mean, just yesterday, there was the announcement that no women faculty or students will be allowed back to the University of Kabul, that the schools for girls will not be reopening, that the mobility restrictions are back in place. So can you give us your perspective on, do you think that the Taliban 20 years later is different? Have its attitudes evolved? And if they have, if you do think so, like, what is it that gives you that hope that it might be different this time around for women?
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, of course, for inviting me to share my views on this conversation. Quite challenging, I would say. And what I will say joins a little bit, or to a large extent, what Zohra was saying. To your question, I would say yes and no. Are they different? Yes and no. And why? Number one, because when we look at the Taliban as a group, it's not homogeneous. In other words, we have some that have maybe progressed and some that have not. But what I will say, which was said by Zohra, is number one, at the very top level of the Taliban leadership today, we have some of them who have been involved in negotiation in Doha. Let us not forget they were not involved in the Bonn negotiation, and I'm sure Zohra will remember that. But this time, for over a year, they have been involved in diplomacy. And I would say they have managed, if they didn't have it, to acquire those skills of dialogue, those skills of negotiation, those skills of bargaining. And so what I think is that from that perspective, today they're different. And when they took over that fateful Sunday, I think we were all scared, but they were basically telling us some good things about how they saw things. So that's one thing. So I think we have a group at the top level that is more savvy, that is more open to negotiation, and therefore we need to take advantage of that. Number two, in relation to the situation, and Zohra alluded to that, is that we have an Afghan population compared to the 90s that has learned a lot, that has tasted freedom, and they are ready to fight for their rights. And on that level, I will basically refer to the women in particular. In the 90s, we never saw women demonstrating on the streets. We never saw that. We do now. And that tells me that because they are ready to defend their rights and not push back, the Taliban have to look at that situation. The third level, or the fourth level, is that the international community today, as a negotiator and as a stakeholder in the engagement with the Taliban, is more knowledgeable about the Taliban than they were in the 90s. So we have a body of knowledge. I say we, sorry about the royal we. We have a body of knowledge that can literally support a dialogue for the Taliban to basically look at how best to govern, although we know governance by coercion is not going to last a long time for the Taliban. They cannot continue to govern Afghanistan by coercion. So for me, yes, they are different. Although what we see, which you have alluded to, which is basically no school, no work for women, and so on and so on, I'm hoping it is a passing moment. Why? Because the Taliban leaders have to continue to appeal to their broader Taliban membership. If they show today that they are lenient and they are not keeping what they said before, they may lose credibility. So they have to suss out themselves where they are at, what they can say, what they can do without endangering their own leadership credibility. Personally, I'm always positive, because if we do not keep the positive outlook, it means we're stepping back and actually not encouraging any effort. And I think the dialogue we have, the Taliban are having exactly the same dialogue. They are moving step by step and trying to position themselves with the international community. So,
okay, let's get, if there are entry points for ensuring women's access to opportunities and services, what might they be? And also, there are many public health researchers and practitioners, I think, listening to the panel. So what do you think the situation of women's access to health and social services will be in immediate to medium term?
I think one of the first things that is going to be very important in the next weeks and months to come, and I am grateful for Zohra for mentioning that, and I think we had a conversation about it, Kathleen, before. So I do remember from my time in the 90s, then during UNAMA as gender advisor, then much later, it is absolutely critical to maintain the link between the top level of any negotiation with the Taliban, any form of negotiation, with the actual ground level. And Zohra was very clear about that. In other words, and I speak, if you want, in relation to the international community, is while engaging in order to secure any entry point, it is important to continue the investment and the support in local initiatives. And I totally agree. This is where we can basically identify entry point, maximize entry point, and therefore secure not only service delivery, but secure access to women's health, education, girls' education. And we've seen it even during the 90s. I think my worry would be if the international community, like, you know, on Monday we were having this round table with the SDG, the deputy to the SG, whereby the worry was, if we continue support for the humanitarian needs and so on, there might be a perception that you're actually recognizing the Taliban as a legitimate government. For me, it's a no-brainer. We continue the humanitarian support while keeping the dialogue with the Taliban. In relation to the specific question on health, two very important elements. Number one is the general health for women who have now left Afghanistan, are in the surrounding countries. How can we be sure that they actually have access to overall health services? And it's a big issue. Number two, within Afghanistan, The worry would be that there is a repeat of the 1990s, i.e., no woman could be treated in hospital unless there are female doctors. So I would say, and I would exactly say the same thing as Zohra, there are a lot of female doctors being treated, and we need to support them and protect them to be able to deliver those services. So that is for general health. If we go back to what they said last week or 2 weeks ago, which is women should make babies instead of working, that for me is a red alert. In other words, if they are going to prevent the delivery of reproductive health services, we need to be prepared for that. And we need to be prepared by making sure, once again, at the very provincial and district and rural areas, those services continue. And in any form of dialogue with the Taliban on the reproductive health, I suggest we look at basically what Islamic teaching tell us in terms of maternal and child health. Even without contraception, the advice is the birth spacing for 2 years in order to protect maternal and child health. So there are many entry points, but I think it's important that we support those entry points where they should be supporting. For instance, last week, they said they were dismantling the women's ministry, and everybody was so worried about if that goes, nothing is going to take place, right? My suggestion is that we need to look at how to ensure through the ministries of education, labor, and so on, there is dedicated support for women's issues to be to continue to function. There is the Human Rights Commission. They have not made any statement on the Afghanistan Human Rights Commission. Can we work through that? And so on and so on.
Okay, thank you very much, Fatia, and I'm sure we'll come back to these issues in the discussion. But now, Jacob, moving to you and moving a little even beyond Afghanistan itself, it'd be great to get your perspective on how US policy has evolved toward Afghanistan recently and perhaps a little longer term over the last couple of decades, and what implications does this policy have for some of the issues that Zohra and Fatia have raised about agency or support to the local level, services for women, the future of civil society organizations in Afghanistan?
Sure, and thank you for including me in the conversation. It's a big question, so I'm going to focus primarily on the humanitarian and development side of it. One thing that I think is interesting about US humanitarian action in Afghanistan is sat within the larger picture of the United States humanitarian portfolio globally. I think Afghanistan, and to a lesser extent Iraq, have been something of an albatross around the neck of the US's humanitarian identity, because for nearly 20 years, the humanitarian and development work that the United States was doing, which achieved immeasurable positive impacts in support of Afghan civilians' ability to access health, education, all these positive impacts, it was so fundamentally tied to a political insecurity endeavor, both overtly out of the mouths of Colin Powell and General Petraeus, and more subtly in the sense that ultimately all United States foreign assistance is in service of foreign policy or national security priorities. And so in Afghanistan, it was just the most explicit representation of that. And you can look a little bit at trend lines of spending. The United States spent some amount of money in Afghanistan prior to 2001. And then you just look at the trajectory, and the money just increased and increased and increased, reaching a pinnacle in about 2011, sort of consistent with the surge of the Obama administration. And it spoke to this idea of, you can't win this war with just boots on the ground. It requires the development and humanitarian assistance that brings populations to see that the narrative that you're offering is a better one. And I say this, again, not to suggest that the money wasn't spent well, but that it very much complicates the picture now, right? Now, one of the hardest things for American policymakers is to come to the realization that you no longer control events, right? That you can no longer dictate the terms of a circumstance. And so for 20 years, all the humanitarian and development assistance, I won't say all, the vast majority of the humanitarian and development assistance was being delivered in a context, in a permissive environment with a government that the United States had a significant amount of influence over. I won't say, I won't overstate the case, because Afghan governments had their own agency and decision making, but the United States clearly had a significant amount of impact on it. And the question now is, to me, the evolution in thinking is going to be, is the United States going to approach Afghanistan pre-2001 as a complicated actor, which it doesn't, which it can't control, like the Taliban between 2003, when they sort of reconstituted, in 2020, right? Which was an entity that controlled some parts of Afghanistan, but was an adversary, but also the United States did fund humanitarian assistance in the areas under the Taliban control? Or is it going to be viewed as an enemy, a total adversary with whom we can't engage whatsoever? And to me, it raises the fundamental question of how the United States can evolve its humanitarian support specifically, given what I would describe as a lot of anger and hurt feelings and a narrative in the United States of they are still our enemy. And so it's answering this question of who the Taliban is with respect to the US government will have a massive implication for how much and how the United States can support the humanitarian and development objectives. And I think the verdict remains out. But I do think the more, one thing that happened in addition to the United States' evolution was the humanitarian sector evolved as well, right? There have been a massive change over the last 15 or 20 years in how humanitarian organizations think about, implement, and evaluate the quality of their work. And one of the big changes in thinking is this idea, loosely put, of letting local organizations, civil society, either NGOs or organic civil society institutions, mosques, community groups, whatever, they should be the ones in the leading the response and leading the charge. It's very complicated for the United States government to fund directly those kinds of organizations. And it's even further complicated by the fact, by this political question of who the Taliban is, because it affects the way that the United States can move money from congressionally authorized and appropriated funding to partners on the ground throughout Afghanistan. And so, I think we have a lot of thinking to do here. And I think that the points that both Zura and Fatiha raised about 20 years of change, we're looking at a different environment, about connecting and understanding with who's on the ground leading the work. Those are kind of the essential questions we as analysts and advocates should be asking as we encourage the United States to remain committed to, at minimum, the humanitarian needs of the Afghan population.
Thanks, Jacob. And in addition to the US, what's your feeling about what other actors are doing? For instance, you mentioned the humanitarian organizations, but the United Nations agencies individually and collectively. I know some of them have stayed, some have left. Do you think they can be a collective force for good, or is the old, divide and conquer strategy already well underway?
Yeah, I think you've seen different approaches. what I would like to see is a greater level of coherence at minimum within the United Nations system. And as you mentioned, I'll come back to this problem of division amongst and within the UN structure. But to the first part of your question, humanitarian organizations, by nature of their mandate, from the get-go, by which I mean, going back to May, when the situation was evolving in the periphery of the country and all the way up through the fall of Kabul and the airport, continued to put out messages that from their perspective, they were committed to stay and deliver. That's the lexicon now. We're going to stay and deliver. And to do so, the first thing they do is duty of care to their staff. So everyone kind of huddled back in and made determinations about what they could and couldn't do. Some organizations like MSF and the Doctors Without Borders and the International Committee of the Red Cross continued to provide essential services even during the active conflict and fall of the various cities. That's what they're very good at doing. I mean, that's the nature of those organizations, is to be able to provide services even in a conflict environment that is rapidly changing, right? Because of the nature of the way that they work. The UN agencies, and in particular the US-based and European NGOs, I think had a slightly more complicated calculus. Because of what I mentioned in my first question, their association with either the United States military and political effort, or the UN has frequently just been a subject of attack by virtue of being associated with adversaries or the international community. They're all committed to staying, and to various degrees, some of the organizations have resumed work. So UNHCR, the UN High Commission for Refugees, has gotten written assurances. The executive director of, or the High Commissioner for UNHCR was in Kabul. The president of the ICRC was in Kabul. The head of the Norwegian Refugee Council, one of the biggest, most effective humanitarian organizations, has been in Kabul, meeting with the Taliban, getting those assurances. The problem is, and this refers to something that I forget if it was, I think it was Zura mentioned, the variations in district and in province, is those assurances that you get in Kabul only go so far, right? One of the challenges in working in Afghanistan, working anywhere, is to what extent does the decision made in Kabul to allow you to work or not work, filter down to the provincial head, filter down to the soldier at the checkpoint, let alone the question about the presence of ISIS-K and Al-Qaeda, confusing operations. Exacerbating that is this thing that you mentioned, which is we've seen around the world an unfortunate circumstance where the World Food Program, UNHCR, and UNICEF, among others, negotiate access and negotiate agreements separately. And what this does is it allows an authority like the Taliban or the Assad government or Al-Shabaab in Somalia, the ability to play these organizations off of each other in a way that at the end of the day does not create the best outcome for the civilian populations they seek to serve. So one thing at this moment that I think would be very important would be for Martin Griffiths at OCHA and the Secretary General and the heads of these agencies to come together and say, what's our unified plan here? What are our red lines? What are our approaches? What can we learn from each other's successes, in the last 2 months and over the last 20 years, to create an environment where all of us can do the different kinds of work that we need to do, again, because all of them should be laser-like focused at the end of the operation at what is the best outcome for the child, the family in need. And the way that things are happening now, it reminds me of what happened in Ethiopia, what happened in Syria, where working separately ended up creating more complications than successes.
Right. Thanks, Jacob. Good. I think we're going to open it up now. We've been getting a steady stream of questions, and there's three that really focus on kind of the global and national political context around Afghanistan. And one, Zura, perhaps you might want to comment on first, is that will the European shift to the right, for instance, the aggressive German attitude toward Afghans, this is a question from the from our participants. Will they hinder the operations of groups like yours by maybe limiting funding?
It's interesting. I saw that question and I was thinking about it. We are sort of in a situation where anybody that holds any extreme views on to any side would, if they get their way, would hinder our work. So we have some donor institutions and some people that have a lot of influence who believe that no money should go into Afghanistan unless full equality is guaranteed between sexes in Afghanistan by the Taliban. Now that is one end of this spectrum, and another end of this spectrum asks for something else. So anything extreme, any stance that is not flexible, that is not pragmatic, would hinder our work. Any knee-jerk reaction, any reaction that takes into account local popularity rather than the impact, thousands of miles away in Afghanistan, any of that would hinder our work. And then this is where we have to constantly engage with those decision makers to help them think a little bit critically. And people who have an affinity to Afghanistan should be doing this constantly. And those that know how to connect us with these decision makers would be greatly useful in making these connections for us.
Okay, thank you, Zura. And you might want to start on this next one, but Fatia and Jacob might want to add. Another question indicates that there seems to be a debate over, or certainly it's reported that the Taliban in the provinces are waiting for central guidelines, about how they should treat women and who can go to school and who can work. And yet it seems, particularly from Fatia and Zora, that you're indicating that the reality is that it bubbles up as much as it pours down. So I guess our participants are wondering, what's the balance, and can the building at the grassroots level be used a negotiating chip to get better national policies? I don't know if either of you just want to make a comment on that.
I think it's both, from top down, trickle down of some of the decisions, and then bottom up influence that then translates into the big stance that the Taliban then communicate. But there's also a third thing. It's about timing. A lot of provinces that were taken weeks before the Taliban took Kabul, they are a little bit further ahead in decision making than Kabul is. So I would give some time. Kabul is bigger, it's more controversial, everybody is on the edge, there's more media. So decisions are being made there a little bit differently. Whereas places that have calmed down a little bit, places like Kandahar, places like Herat, there you can see that the locals, especially Herat is an incredibly interesting case study in this. You can see that the Taliban decision-making there really reflect the spirit of the city. And same thing, I come from the north, I come from Balkh, and I can see the same thing there. There's more leeway given to women there. Although overall, the Taliban in the north say, oh, we will let you know under what circumstances could women go to work. But then in practice, my cousins are going to work, and in individual
Excuse me, I think we should mute. Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Zura.
No, I'll pass.
Okay,
to
great. Fatia, do you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you very much. I think Zohra is like my twin sister. It's precisely the same view based on experience in the 90s. In other words, two things. It's easier to negotiate at the provincial, district, and any other level, and we've done it in the 90s, based on Islamic principle of girls' education. And even I remember in one of the provinces to say, could women be part of the Shura Council? And they say, maybe not sitting with the men, but they can have their own, and then they can pass on their views to the male Shura Council. So I would say, yes, it's important to support that. And also, like Zohra was saying, there is too much focus on the capital. I saw it also in Somalia when I was in Somalia. There's too much focus at the moment and before on Kabul. And therefore, the Taliban leaders there are taking their time to basically state what they want to do and not do. And so I think we should be more strategic in the sense that, once again, while we're investing in the negotiation at the top level, is to support continuity or continuation of any efforts currently happening with results in relation to women going to work, girls going to school, etc., etc. If we allow for a vacuum to be there and to continue, it's much more difficult to actually pick up and strengthen. So that would be precisely what I think should happen now. And we know that from colleagues on the ground, both Afghan and non-Afghans, despite all the media frenzy today, things are happening. People are going to work. The humanitarian delivery is taking place. And Jacob, thank you very much for mentioning all those very high level visits over the past few days. And I think from discussion with the Deputy Secretary General, as you were saying, and precisely, they are getting together to have a common, coherent, consistent approach to what they need to do. Because I remember in the 90s, only us, WFP and UNICEF, were present in Afghanistan. And there was so many conditionality related to, I'm speaking for my former agency, for the delivery of food aid, and less women were allowed to participate equally, and so on and so on. I think we have learned from that, and I'm hoping we have learned well from those experiences. That's the body knowledge that I spoke about in the beginning. Thank you, Kathleen. And
great, Fatia. There's a couple of questions around the Taliban specifically. And Jacob, maybe we could start this one with you. There's a question about what's the greatest misconception, or maybe the most dangerous misconceptions that Americans can have about the Taliban, and maybe it's beyond Americans, that, you know, will actually impact what happens in Afghanistan negatively if that doesn't get straightened out.
Well, I mean, on this one in particular, I would defer to the expertise of Fatiha and Zura, but maybe I could speak to the ignorance of Americans and let the experts talk about Taliban. I mean, I think they've already really hit it on the head, which is this is a coherent, unified entity that we can understand with simplistic narratives, right? The idea that there is, you know, that from my perspective, there is a prevailing sense, at least at the political level, of there is one Taliban, and a decision that's made in Kabul will be respected and abided by throughout the country. And we should understand everyone's motivations, from the small fighter, you know, from the rural fighter in the furthest province, you know, to the Minister of Internal Security, as having the exact same motivations, attitudes, and perspectives. And the reason that it becomes problematic is, and I'll speak specifically to US policy, is we have sanctions on the Taliban, which complicate the ability to provide assistance even in parts of the country where the local leadership may have a very different view that we can deal with, right? I mean, I don't think any Taliban commander is not going to be that palatable to, you know, a United States senator, But there are places where the situation is better and worse. And the fact that we have, designated the Taliban as a specially designated global terrorist organization, and have not clarified what that means in terms of their de facto control over a whole country, makes it very complicated for humanitarian organizations to even do that kind of provincial and local level negotiating. So to me, that is one of the biggest misconceptions. I'll turn to my colleagues.
Okay, Zohra and then Fatia.
Just before I answer this question, I'd like to say that I am 38 years old and I've never seen a dead body that hasn't been killed by the Taliban. So I do really feel that pain. I lived through the Taliban period last time they were there. My school was closed and I've personally suffered a lot under the Taliban rule. So please don't take this as a sort of a die-hard fangirling of the Taliban here. But there's one request that I have of everybody. Please do not dehumanize the Taliban. It may not be misconception per se, but there is this tendency of us dehumanizing the Taliban. They're multidimensional individuals, and they need to, as Jacob said, that they differ in views. But I feel that this dehumanization of them as people who are only capable of cruelty, people who are not able to change, people that we should not at all at the human level engage with, this is only going to exacerbate the already growing culture of violence in Afghanistan. I led a research project where we talked to Taliban members and who were at that time Taliban members and who had left the Taliban members. And we talked to them, and I spent 8-10 hours talking to each level of the Taliban member. And then they told me about their love for their mother. They told me about falling in love. They told me about the pressure of being a certain type of man, the pressure of being a certain type of Muslim or certain type of Afghan, the pressure of trying to find out what is true, what's not true, the pressure of being a child soldier and having to act a certain way, and the desire to get out, the desire to progress. And I think that is where, if we focus a little bit on that human aspect and not completely see them as these robotic evil beings, then I think we have a lot of more, we would have a bit more chance of success engaging with them as professionals, but also as humans who would have to live with them.
Thank you very much. Zohra, you want to add something, Fatia?
Kathleen, I support what Zohra was saying, as well as Jacob. In other words, we cannot apply a blanket statement, understanding, description of the Taliban. And I had a similar issue when I was in Somalia. All Al-Shabaab, they're all the same. And once you sit, and I was prevented, obviously being DSG, from trying to engage with them. You sit with them and you realize, like with the Taliban, when I was there up until 2012, you realize you have human beings like all of us with good and bad things, right? And circumstances push people to join movements that are violent. And I think it's important to recognize that and to see what are the rules of engagement by recognizing that. So, blanket sanctions, and I remember in the 90s, the women themselves said, by preventing food delivery, you are making us suffer because we do not have food on the table. So by having blanket sanctions, we are trying to resolve an issue, but create a much larger issue. So my plea, like Zohra was saying and Jacob, is let's pause, let's analyze and differentiate what levels we can engage at, how, and with whom, without excluding, but it's a progressive process of engagement where precisely by engaging, listening, and supporting, we can bring in more of those Taliban into an environment that is positive for them and the broader Afghan community, which need it. They've had enough, they have suffered enough. So I think we owe it to them. It's our collective responsibility to make that effort. Thank you.
Thank you. We have some fascinating questions that we're not going to obviously be able to get to all of them, but there is one about the Taliban seems so far, at least what we hear outside of Afghanistan, is the Taliban have come to power and maintain their power through relatively violent and coercive means. Is there an impression by those of you that that are working closer to this, that the Taliban want to learn other ways of governing? You know, are they interested? Are there incentives for leadership and legitimacy that could be offered to the Taliban? You know, in other words, are they interested in having their governing capacities? Are they open to having their governing capacities strengthened? Maybe Fatia, you want to start?
Once again, sorry to take the floor. I would start by saying, actually, they have no choice. We know from Africa with all the military regime that they do not last long. So leading through coercion is not a sustainable element. And so I think, once again, in our negotiation, I won't call it negotiation, in our dialogue is really to have a basis whereby one can demonstrate that in order to be able to sustain their leadership, obviously, it is important to look at governance without coercion, because it's not sustainable, and they've seen it, right, from the 90s. They will try, without any doubt, because they know no other way of doing it so far. But our collective responsibility is to offer the kind of support whereby they can acquire, if they don't have it, the skills to govern in a bit more peaceful way. And I think that might happen if we build a rapport of trust, if they trust us and if we trust them. So our investment over the next few weeks or months is to try and have a dialogue, and no dialogue can succeed if it's not based on listening, respecting, and building trust. Otherwise, they won't listen to us. We'll be frightened of them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if either Jacob or Zora want to add to that before Jacob?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in. You know, I don't, this is a university, so you use a political science term, right? Like, I think it's worthwhile thinking about what their interests are, right? And seeing where and how interests can align. And even if it's at very basic human issues as opposed to geopolitical considerations, I think there are interests that align, right? Their interest is in maintaining some level of power. And the way that they can achieve that is by demonstrating a certain capacity for service delivery, right? My interest, or the humanitarian interest, might be providing support to people who are, through no fault of their own, suffering from great harms. There's a global challenge, I think, for armed insurgencies or armed groups to transition to governing actors, right? There's very few great successes, you know, maybe the ANC, although that hasn't really been that smooth either, but of rebels or insurgents who take power by force, transitioning to becoming, leaders. But I would associate myself with Fatia's comments that there has to be some sort of effort to try. And I think it speaks to the previous question, right? the civilian casualty figures in the last year were rising rapidly over the previous few years, right? They were coming by force, but they were not as bad as they could have been because there was clearly a simultaneous effort underway to do with force what needed to be done with force, and with money or coercion or negotiation what could be done otherwise. And the leadership has been living in Qatar for 15 years, right? They obviously have a deep and meaningful political relationship with the government of Pakistan, with government of Qatar. They've hosted the Chinese, they've hosted the Russians. So there's something different happening here that I think is worthwhile, in engaging to a certain extent, while always remembering and keeping in back of mind and front of mind the brutality and some of the decisions that are happening today, right? Like, no, this should not be glossed over in any way, but I do think it's worthwhile to try.
Thank you, Jacob. I think there are some questions that we're not going to be able to get to. I think partially because I'm not sure the panelists are in a position to answer them, but I want to recognize that they're important questions. There's a question about what is happening to Afghan soldiers. Are they being hunted down? Is there any support being offered to them? I don't know if any of the panelists have any insight into that. There's another question about what can local CBOs in the US do to serve the Afghans that are coming here better, or what contribution can they make? So I'm not sure that we can comment on those issues, but I just wanted, there's also another important one, which I'm not sure we have time, which is what is happening to the ethnic groups under the Taliban, like the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, the Hazara, and is there any way to support those groups? But I put those questions out there because in the final takeaway messages, if anyone can address those questions, that would be great. I think some of the messages that have come across is that, yes, the Taliban have changed. They need to be differentiated. We need to avoid dehumanizing. We need to be looking for entry points and incentivizing and figuring out what are the positive interactions that can happen with the Taliban. We need to understand that Afghanistan is diverse and that different things are happening in different parts of Afghanistan, and it's not one size fits all, that there's a lot to be done in terms of local leadership, that there are entry points, that in fact, life is continuing in some parts of Afghanistan, and we need to figure out how that's happening and what support those leaders need to continue to have and how other leaders can be supported in that direction. And I think the comments about US policy and external support or pressure that can be brought on to bear on the situation were also important. So I just want to end by asking each of the panelists just to perhaps give a one or two sentences of closing remarks. Just what would you like the participants to leave the meeting with? When they click off this Zoom panelist, what's one or two things you'd really like them to remember? So maybe Jacob, will start with you.
Sure, I'll answer with reference to the question about community organizations in the United States and what they can do. I mean, one, it's worth saying that the United States is a complicated country, and even where there's things that are our worst, there are things that are our best. So for all the vitriol about refugees, you also have throughout the country community organizations coming together to raise money and raise funds and raise support to welcome those who have come into the United States. What I think is incredibly important and is for those people to not just do that work, but also speak to their congressmen and congresswomen and senators and mayors and governors, because the United States humanitarian response is partly about accepting refugees and partly about what we do overseas. And this dehumanization that we've had about the Taliban has also manifested in certain communities about Afghan civilians who, through no fault of their own, are experiencing great harm. And so if you are motivated, tell your mayor right? That you want your town to be a welcoming community for refugees, Afghan or otherwise. Tell your governor to make your state a welcoming state. And we saw, even during the fall, the airport scenes on the news, there was a member of Congress who wrote that he literally had not heard from one constituent that this was an issue that resonated. So you as constituents telling your member of Congress or your senator that you care not just about what happens, vis-a-vis refugee admissions, but you care that the United States maintains a humanitarian perspective and approach towards Afghanistan will matter because they're not hearing it. And those kinds of phone calls, I can tell you as a staffer, they do matter. And so making your voice heard, I think, is an incredibly useful way, and very easy, relatively speaking, to impact decision-making at the highest levels.
Important point, Jacob. Thanks. Fatia.
What can I say after that? I think we should all do that. We are doing the same kind of thing here in the UK in relation to our MPs and so on. So that's very important. Maybe two things that I would like for us to leave this conversation. Number one is, let us keep an open and positive approach to what could be done in Afghanistan, rather than just rehashing the negative. And to do that, it would be very good that we engage either through social media and or through formal media, so that there is reporting on positive entry points, so that there is an encouragement to that. And we change the narrative towards what solutions are possible that we can work on. I think that's number one. Two, I'd like to come back to the issue of what happens with all the ethnic groups. I think it is a very important conversation to be had, maybe in a future discussion. And I would like to recall that at the very beginning, when the Taliban took over on that fateful Sunday, they used the term inclusive government. So it is important, again, through the media to go back to that. And I remember my very first post was about that, but to say inclusion about the Uzbek, the Pashtun and so on, but also women. Mm-hmm. And we could go back to some of the provisions of the Bonn Agreement. I'm sure Zohra will remember that. And again, be very vocal about advocating that. We have now an interim government, and this is the time to really focus on an inclusive government of all ethnic groups, but also full participation of women. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatia. Zora, last word to you.
Thank you very much. I just want to go back to what we can do. Perhaps not directly what we can do as individuals, but what we can do as a community of various different types of people and institutions. The Taliban are violent, and their direct violence can be dealt with through direct pressure, through conditionality. They are the way they treat minorities, the way they treat women, the way they dish out justice. These things could be dealt with some sort of aid conditionality that everybody is talking about. But the indirect and the structural violence that is going to be if not worked on, that is going to be in the future of Afghan people, we need to deal with. We cannot deal with that from outside of Afghanistan. The structural violence, the laws that are going to be created, the institutions that are going to be created, people's freedoms, they need to be continuously worked on by empowered Afghan people, by well-connected Afghan people, by Afghan people who are not prevented by needless bureaucracy and gatekeeping. So let's make sure that both of them are there. And let's make sure, as we deal with direct and indirect violence of the Taliban, that we are showing proportionate reaction. I do not want us to be again the victim of that knee-jerk reaction that let's not do anything, let's not spend $100 in Afghanistan just in case $1 goes to the Taliban because we don't like the Taliban. So let's make sure that there's proportionality, there's deep thinking behind it. I also want to echo the positivity. As an Afghan woman, I see that sometimes in the last month or so, we have been given very little space to be happy. And we need to be happy, and we need to be able to take care of ourselves. And I want to leave you with a little message that as I was waiting for all of you to be let into this, this meeting, I sent a message to my young colleague. She's an assistant in our office and she's working from home, a young woman, very, very capable. And I said, how's your day going? And she said that she went to see her sister, and I said, what did you wear? And she sent a beautiful picture. She's 22 years old, and she sent a beautiful picture of herself dressed very similar to the way she used to dress when I was in Kabul back in July. She was wearing a robe and a headscarf, and she was wearing those, you know, those silver trainers that everybody else is wearing in Europe as well. And I said, so how did you get there? Did you go with your brother? You went to see your sister? Did you go with your brother or your father? And she said, no, she went by public transport. And I said, how was that? She said that there was a Taliban in front of us. And I said, how did you feel? She said, nothing. I just nudged my my cousin who was sitting next to me, another girl, and said, look, did you ever think that you'd be sitting and sharing a public bus with the Taliban? And we laughed. And I think this is Taliban are violent, yes, but let us give some space for this 22-year-old woman to enjoy being in the public transport, to go and visit someone, and then get that energy to tomorrow be a little bit depressed and fight for her right to go to university and go to work. Let's not create such a big monster out of the Taliban that this young woman would not be able to enjoy some fresh air. So this is my last message for you, and thank you so much to everybody.
Yes, I think really I want to thank everyone. That's a great note on which to end the panel. I want to thank all the participants on behalf of the Dean and the Center for Immigrant, Refugee, and Global Health at the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy. And really 1,000 thanks to Jacob, to Fatia, and to Zora for really insightful comments, sharing your insights, your energy, your perspectives. We truly appreciate it. And we think we have many more participants that will follow the situation more closely and hopefully send a message to someone who can make a difference. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.